Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Talk Speak podcast. Today, we're plunging into a topic that, well, it hits close to home for just about everyone. The future of your car and how much it might cost you. We're doing a deep dive into the potential fallout from the Trump 2.0 tariffs on the automotive industry.
Yeah, and our mission today is really to pull out the crucial insights from this comprehensive report, the one titled seismic. Think of it as your shortcut to understanding the big changes these evolving tariff policies could bring. And it's not just about the sticker price, right? It's about the parts in your car, even where things are headed with electric vehicles. This report, it really pulls back the curtain.
Exactly. Buying a car, it's a huge decision for most people, and the auto industry itself is this massive interconnected web. These tariffs feel like a major disruption hitting that system. So we're going to zero in on the most critical bits and, some surprising ripple effects the analysis points out. Okay, let's get straight into this Trump 2.0 tariff framework. It's not just like one tax on imported cars, is it?
No, not at all. That's what's fascinating here. It's really a multi-layered approach. We're talking about several key tariffs, some proposed, some already in effect. The first big one, 25% on imported whole vehicles, cars, SUVs, trucks. That kicked in April 3rd, 2025.
Okay, 25% on the whole car.
Yeah. Then, just about a month later, May 3rd, another 25% tariff hit a huge range of auto parts. And I mean, broad engines, transmissions, electrical bits, bumpers, wipers, tires, even lubricants. Over 150 different categories affected by that one.
Wow, 150 categories. That's a lot of parts.
Yeah.
And I guess it doesn't stop there.
You got it. There's also a 25% tariff on imported steel and aluminum, the basic building blocks for cars. And maybe the most significant one, a 10% universal baseline tariff. This applies to almost all goods coming into the U.S.
10% on everything.
Pretty much everything. Kicked in April 5th, 2025. And here's the kicker: it stacks on top of those other specific tariffs we just talked about.
On top? Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you can see how these layers start to really add up fast.
And wasn't there talk about tariffs aimed at specific countries, too? Reciprocal ones?
Yes, exactly. The report mentions proposed reciprocal tariffs. Could have been as high as 50% on goods from lots of countries. No, most of those. They're suspended for 90 days, at least for now. But China's the big exception. They're already facing really high barriers. The key thing here, the report stresses, is the uncertainty this creates. Policy keeps shifting. Suspensions are temporary. Tariffs could come back anytime. It's this policy whiplash. Makes long-term planning incredibly tough for automakers.
Right, like trying to hit a moving target. So, okay, who's feeling the most heat from all this? Which countries, which trade partners are really in the spotlight?
Well, it definitely varies. China, like we said, is facing major hurdles. We're talking 47.5% on cars imported from there. At one point, it was potentially up to 145% on all imports before some adjustments. It really signals a strong push, to decouple supply chains from China.
Okay, China's clearly a focus. What about our neighbors, Canada and Mexico? Under USMCA, you'd think they'd have some protection.
That's where it gets really interesting, maybe even a bit surprising. Even if a vehicle complies with USMCA rules, right? If it contains parts not made in the U.S., those non-U.S. parts still get hit with a 25% tariff based on their value.
So even if it's USMCA compliant overall?
Yeah. The report really emphasizes the goal here isn't just bringing manufacturing to North America generally. It's very specifically about bringing it to the United States. And for vehicles that don't meet USMCA rules, they could face even higher tariffs, like 50, maybe 52.5%. It's worth remembering an initial 25% tariff on all imports from Canada and Mexico was later dropped for compliant goods, but this focus on U.S. content is key.
So a car made in Mexico, if it has, say, German electronics inside, those parts could still face the tariff.
Precisely. The analysis also points to the EU as a big target. Potential reciprocal tariffs there too, maybe 20%. There's some are on hold. The UK has a special deal, 10% on the first 100,000 cars, then 25% after that. And major exporters like Japan and South Korea, they're facing the standard 25% car tariff, plus maybe those reciprocal duties later. The whole strategy seems geared towards reshaping trade, favoring countries aligned with U.S. goals, and really pressuring partners like Canada and Mexico to use more U.S. stuff.
Okay, bringing manufacturing back home seems like the main driver. Are there other goals behind these tariffs mentioned in the report?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The report lists several. Revitalizing U.S. manufacturing is definitely number one, but they also cite national security concerns using Section 232 of that Trade Expansion Act.
Right.
Addressing trade deficits and what they call unfair trade practices is another big one. Plus, pushing for better compliance with those USMCA rules of origin, the tariffs make it more expensive not to comply. The report also mentions, kind of briefly, the idea of using tariff money to replace other taxes. But, well, most economists cited are pretty skeptical about that actually working out.
Sounds like maybe some conflicting goals there, or at least potential unintended consequences.
That's a really critical point the analysis makes. There are inherent tensions. Economists doubt these tariffs will achieve the goals without causing major economic disruption, like increased costs for U.S. manufacturers who still need imported parts for certain things. So the aim might be boosting U.S. industry, but the reality could be, well, a lot messier.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty, the mechanisms, the fine print, any potential relief measures. What are the complexities there?
Right. There are definitely layers of complexity. First, those USMCA rules of origin, the ROs, they got tougher. For cars, it's now 75% regional value content, meaning parts made in North America, plus 70% North American steel and aluminum. And there are labor value rules, too. The tariffs basically act as the enforcement stick for these tougher rules.
Okay, stricter rules. And what about parts from outside North America?
That's where the 25% tariff on non-USMCA parts kicks in, even on otherwise compliant vehicles from Canada or Mexico. And exactly what counts as a U.S. part, that's a key detail. And apparently there's been a lot of debate about it. Then you have these tariff offset or refund mechanisms. These are specifically for manufacturers assembling cars in the U.S. They can get some money back on the tariffs they paid for imported parts.
Oh, okay. How does that offset work exactly?
So for the first year, April 2025 to April 2026, the offset is 3.75% of the car's MSRP, the sticker price. Then it drops to 2.5% for the second year. After year 2, it's scheduled to end.
So it's temporary.
Temporary, yeah. And the report explains those percentages roughly equal the total tariff you'd pay on about 15% of the part's value in year 1 and 10% in year 2, assuming that 25% parts tariff. So theoretically, a car with 85% US or USMCA parts might pay 0 net parts tariff in year 1. That threshold goes up to 90% in year 2.
85 to 90% U.S. or North American content. That sounds really high.
It is high. And the analysis stresses that very few cars made in the U.S. currently meet those thresholds. The report mentions Toyota and Honda estimating they need like 18 to 24 months just to adjust their supply chains enough.
Okay. Any other rules or clauses in the fine print?
Yeah, there's this anti-stacking clause. Basically prevents double dipping on tariffs. You won't pay both the steel tariff and the parts tariff on the same component, for instance, or extra tariffs on Canadian-Mexican goods already hit by the main car tariffs.
Makes sense.
There's also a process mentioned to add more parts to the tariff list based on national security, so more potential changes down the line. And a few exemptions. Cars like 25 years plus, and UFMCA compliant parts are temporarily exempt while they figure out how to tax the non-US value within them.
So it seems like getting the full benefit of those offsets requires a huge amount of U.S. or regional content, which most cars don't have yet, and the offsets are temporary anyway.
Exactly. That complexity, the high thresholds, the temporary nature, it all feeds into how the market reacted initially. What did the report say about those first impacts?
Right. Let's talk initial reactions. Module 1 in the report. What happened with costs right away?
Costs spiked almost immediately. Steel, aluminum up 25%. Semiconductors, already scarce, faced a potential 25% tariff. The report estimated that could add, $188 to $219 per car.
Ouch. On top of existing shortages.
Yeah. And EV batteries got hit hard. Tariffs on lithium, cobalt, nickel, imported packs, plus a potential huge anti-dumping duty on Chinese graphite. The report suggests maybe 125% cost increase just from that. The 25% tariff alone could add nearly $1,900 to a typical $7,500 battery pack.
Wow, that's massive for EVs.
It is. Other key parts, too. Engines, transmissions, ECUs, that 25% tariff. The report used an ECU example. Maybe $220 up to $275. Electronic parts generally saw input costs jump 15–22%.
So costs shooting up everywhere.
Pretty much. And the report highlights this cascading effect through the supply chain. Plus, remember that 10% universal tariff adding costs at every import stage. So unsurprisingly, analysts immediately predicted MSRP increases. Big ones. Anywhere from $2,000 to $15,000 per vehicle, depending on the estimate in the car.
$15,000.
That was on the high end, especially for imports. Cox Automotive guessed an average jump around $5,300. S&P and J.D. Power saw 5–10% increases by the end of 2025.
Did automakers just raise prices right away?
The report says there was some initial hesitation, but the expectation was clear. Costs would eventually get passed to consumers, which, just makes the existing car affordability problem worse. Average new cars were already nearing $50.
Yeah, affordability is already tough, so prices going up. What about actual production? Did things slow down?
Yes. Production delays and adjustments were another big initial reaction. The report cited specific examples: Stellantis idling its Windsor plant temporarily, Nissan stopping some SUV exports from Mexico to the U.S., BMW apparently delaying some EV production, Infiniti pausing supply of certain models to the U.S.
So real impacts on factory lines.
Definitely. Cox Automotive even predicted maybe 20,000 fewer cars built per day in the U.S. by mid-April 2025. Major forecasters, S&P, Global Mobility, Global Data, CRU Group, all cut their 2025 North American production forecasts significantly. We're talking maybe 800,000 to over 1.2 million fewer vehicles. And the report notes, shifting production to the U.S. takes years and billions. So the immediate hit was more likely cuts at plants outside the U.S.
Sounds like the whole global supply chain was just reeling.
Absolutely. It's so integrated. Tariffs create ripples everywhere. The report basically says there's no purely American car anymore because parts come from all over. They expected slower supplier deliveries due to customs delays at U.S. ports. Risk of retaliation tariffs from other countries was a big worry too, like China did before. And they mentioned the potential bullwhip effect, panic buying before tariffs hit, then demand crashing as prices rise, causing huge inventory swings.
So what did happen with U.S. car sales initially? Did people stop buying?
Forecasts pointed down. S&P Global Mobility cut their 2025 U.S. sales forecast by 700,000 units right off the bat. Global Data saw a big drop, too, like 6.6% year-over-year. Cox expected a sales slump after an initial rush, higher new and used prices, maybe some models getting canceled. TrendForce predicted a 3% sales hit if those Mexico-Canada tariffs stayed at 25%.
Was there an initial rush?
Yeah, interestingly, there was a bump in buying activity right before prices were expected to jump. April 2025 average transaction prices rose more than usual month over month, but the report suggests that was probably temporary people pulling demand forward, trying to buy before the hikes, which could mean a sharper sales drop later on.
Okay, so that was the initial shockwave. But the report has an update from May 2025. Did things look any better by then? Had those relief measures helped?
Well, despite those offsets and anti-sacking rules being confirmed, the updated analysis showed forecasts for U.S. sales and production were still pretty negative. S&P Global Mobility in April 2025 still saw about 700,000 fewer U.S. sales for 2025 and projected even bigger drops for 26 and 27. Global Data stuck to similar lower forecasts. S&P Global Ratings also cut their expectations for 25 and 26 sales. TrendForce held to their negative 3% prediction if the Mexico-Canada tariffs stayed high.
So sales forecasts still down. What about production? Any improvement there?
Not really. Production forecasts also stayed grim. S&P Global Mobility's April update still predicted about 1.28 million fewer vehicles made in North America in 2025, with ongoing negative impacts. Global Data kept their 850K reduction for 2025 and warned the total shortfall could hit 4 million by 2028 if tariffs persisted. CRU Group also significantly lowered their 2025 production forecast.
Wow. So even with offsets and clarifications, the big analysts were still seeing major sustained declines in both sales and production.
That's a key takeaway from the update. The relief measures, while maybe helping at the margins, weren't seen as enough to counter the core negative impact of the overall tariff structure. The report suggests it's because they're complex, the thresholds are really high, and they're temporary. The market seemed to be settling in for a period of high costs and low sales.
Let's go back to those key parts. Semiconductors, EV batteries, ECUs. How did the updated picture look for them specifically?
For semiconductors, the reliance on imports like 65% foreign-sourced meant that potential 25% tariff was still a huge shadow hanging over the industry. That $188 to $219 extra cost per car remained a big threat. And the report reiterates building domestic chip capacity, that takes a very long time, even with things like the CHEPS Act. Higher chip prices could force automakers to, eat the cost, raise prices, or maybe even decontent cars, cut features. That could slow down tech adoption.
Right, and EV batteries.
Right.
Still looking like a major challenge.
Definitely. The tariffs on materials like lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, plus imported battery packs, that still looked like a serious barrier to EVs reaching cost parity with gas cars and really taking off. Significant cost hikes were still expected. The reliance on China for processing critical minerals was flagged again as a major vulnerability. And while U.S. battery production is growing, thanks partly to IRA incentives, the report says it's just not enough to meet demand without tariff-free imports. These tariffs create huge investment uncertainty for the U.S. EV battery supply chain. Projects might get delayed or canceled if input costs jump too high. It could actually undermine the IRA's goals and scare off investment.
And the ECUs. those little electronic control units.
Yeah, the 25% parts tariff still applied. That $55 price hike example might seem small per unit, but the report makes this crucial point. Modern cars have dozens, sometimes over 100 of these ECUs.
Oh.
So that small increase gets multiplied across the whole car. It becomes a significant kind of hidden cost increase overall. Managing all those electronic parts and their costs is complex. It's actually one reason the industry is slowly moving towards software-defined vehicles. They offer more flexibility long-term.
Okay, so rising costs, supply issues persisting. How was this reshaping the actual U.S. car market? What shifts did the updated analysis see?
Continued shifts in buyer behavior. Likely more demand for used cars, which could push their prices up too. People delaying new purchases, holding on to cars longer. Good for the repair shops maybe, but tough for new sales.
Right, the aftermarket.
Yeah. And segment preferences changing. Economy cars, often thin margins, lots of imported content, they face the biggest risk of price hikes or just being dropped altogether. The luxury market, very import-heavy, would see big price jumps too, maybe shifting some demand to high-end American brands or used luxury cars. Trucks and SUVs with more U.S. production had a bit more cushion, but still vulnerable due to imported parts. And EVs, higher prices from tariffs, plus potential changes to incentives, looked set to slow down adoption. The report noted EV average prices actually rose early in 2025 while gas cars stayed flat, and EV sales dipped month over month in April.
What about the competition between brands? Domestic versus imports?
The analysis expected shifts favoring domestic production overall. GM, Ford, Stellantis could gain share if imports got way more expensive. But even domestic makers face higher costs from imported parts. Ford, with maybe 80% U.S. assembly, looked potentially better off than GM in that respect. Asian brands Toyota, Honda, Hyundai Kia, heavily reliant on imports from Japan, Korea, Mexico, they looked disadvantaged. European brands faced similar issues. The report even mentioned a risk of market balkanization.
Balkanization, what does that mean here?
Like, automakers might just focus on their most profitable models under tariffs and stop importing less profitable ones, especially niche or economy cars. That could shrink consumer choice, make the U.S. market less diverse. The report mentioned Volvo S90, Infiniti QX50, QX55 as examples potentially at risk.
And focusing back on EVs specifically, the ecosystem impact.
Still look challenging. Higher EV prices slowing adoption, especially if that $7,500 tax credit gets changed or removed. The battery supply chain looked very vulnerable, reliant on imported minerals, often processed in China, and imported components. Tariffs could disrupt that, raise costs, maybe even discourage investment in U.S. battery plants if inputs get too pricey.
Widening the price gap with gas cars.
Exactly. And the uncertainty around future EV incentives under a potential Trump 2.0 administration was a big factor. Ending credits would be a major blow. Interestingly, the analysis suggested Tesla, with its U.S. base, might actually benefit if subsidies disappeared across the board, reducing competition. But overall, the report highlights this clash, wanting to boost EVs versus slapping tariffs on the very things needed to make them affordable. Huge uncertainty for manufacturers pouring billions into electrification.
A real policy conflict there. Okay, what about the folks keeping older cars running, the aftermarket?
Also facing headwinds. Tariffs on imported OEM and aftermarket parts mean higher costs for repair shops and ultimately for you, the consumer. The report cited examples: brake kits maybe $100 more, suspension parts $300 more.
Ouch.
Yeah. Could also mean fewer parts available, leading to repair delays. Independent shops worried about sourcing parts. Larger chains were already adjusting prices. Could even affect insurance premiums if claim costs rise due to pricier parts. And there's that dynamic. Fewer people buying new means more demand for repairs, right? But tariffs make repair parts more expensive and maybe harder to get. It's a double pressure, potentially hitting hardest those who can least afford a new car.
It really does touch every part of the car world.
Okay, Module 3, the report looked at specific automakers. GM, Ford, Toyota. What were the key risks and responses for GM? For GM, risks included reliance on Mexico, Canada for some production and parts, plus tariffs on indirect material imports. But the report also noted GM had worked since 2019 to boost U.S. sourcing over 80% of their supply chain, now USMCA compliant, mostly U.S.-based. Strong in U.S. trucks SUVs, good Q1 EV sales growth. Still, the estimated financial hit for 2025 was big, $4 to $5 billion, led them to lower their profit forecast.
So what are they doing about it?
Announced plans to boost U.S. truck production in Indiana, expand U.S. battery module assembly, hoping to offset about 30% of the tariff impact that way. Continued focus on USMCA compliance, nearshoring. They have a big U.S. plant footprint, which helps expand capacity more efficiently than building new. But even offsetting 30% leaves a huge chunk of cost. Shifting everything takes time. They still need some imported parts, especially for EVs and tech. Uncertainty makes planning hard.
Right. Even with a lot of U.S. production, they can't fully escape it. What about Ford?
Ford also relies on cross-border supply chains, especially Mexico diesel engines for F-Series trucks made there, for example. Even though 80% of their U.S. sales are U.S. assembled, many parts are imported, heavily reliant on the profitable F-Series. And their EV division, Model E, was already losing billions annually. Tariffs could make that worse with higher EV part costs.
What was the financial impact estimate for Ford?
They suspended their full-year 2025 earnings guidance, expected about a $1.5 billion net negative hit to adjusted EBIT from tariffs in 2025. Total impact maybe $2.5 billion, hoping to offset $1 billion through other actions.
And their responses?
Some tactical moves, using bonded transport, moving stuff from Mexico via Canada to the U.S. to try and avoid some direct tariffs. Stopped exporting U.S.-made cars to China. They highlighted their big U.S. production investments and ran that From America, for America discount for everyone. But the report suggests these tariffs are a strategic threat, especially to the struggling EV division. It could delay profitability, complicate the whole electrification plan. Even the F-Series is vulnerable to parts tariffs.
Okay, and finally, Toyota. It seemed like they were quite exposed.
Very exposed, yeah. Highly reliant on importing finished cars and parts from Japan. U.S. plants were running near capacity, limiting flexibility to shift production quickly. The U.S. is a huge market for them, about a quarter of global sales. Models like RAV4, Camry, Lexus, hybrids all face varying tariff impacts depending on where they're made and where parts come from.
The financial hit looks potentially enormous for Toyota.
It did. At least $1.25, $1.3 billion profit loss just for April-May 2025. Some analysts suggested the full fiscal year hit could be over $10 billion.
Wow. What was their response?
Considering shifting some RAV4 production to the U.S., but maybe not until 2027, said they'd look at expanding U.S. production mid to long term. Short term, they decided to absorb the extra tariff costs for their North American suppliers importing parts from Mexico, Canada.
Absorb the cost. That's huge.
Yeah. Protects suppliers, maybe stabilizes the chain. They also initially held U.S. prices steady, waiting to see how U.S.-Japan trade talks went. CEO said no hasty price hikes. It's a tough balancing act for them. Massive immediate cost impact versus long, costly production shifts. Shifting RAV4 is a big strategic move, but takes years. Absorbing costs hits profits hard. Trade talks are crucial for their final strategy. It's this short-term endure, long-term adjust situation.
So pulling this all together, these tariffs, they're clearly a massive deal. We're seeing significant potential cost increases passed to you, the consumer, vulnerable supply chains, needing major overhauls, shrinking market demand, shifts in what people buy, real headwinds for the EV transition, and very different risks and responses from giants like GM, Ford, and Toyota.
Exactly. The report really shows a systemic shock hitting the global and U.S. auto industry. Automakers face these incredibly difficult choices: cost, efficiency, supply chain security, policy risk. And the final impact, it really depends on how tariff details evolve, how trade partners react, and, the wider global economy.
So for you, listening in, hopefully this deep dive has cut through some of the noise and highlighted what really matters from this analysis. These tariffs could seriously change the price of your next car, what cars are even available, and the whole future path of the auto industry. Maybe think about the wider ripples too. How could these shifts affect not just your car purchase, but things like auto repair, insurance, maybe even city planning if EV adoption slows? What other unexpected effects might pop up down the road?
Those are definitely the big questions we'll be watching unfold. It's a dynamic situation.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.